Hi there. This will be the second video in my Invalid Prooftext series. Now, one verse that's often used is Hebrews 9:27, and it reads as this: "Just as it is appointed that human beings die once, and after this the judgment." And the argument that's essentially made from this, it's not that complex, is that there's no purgatory, because it isn't mentioned here. Just as it is appointed that human beings die once, and after this the judgment. The argument essentially being purgatory is not mentioned, it goes straight from death to judgment, so there's no interim period, there's no interim state, so there's no room for purgatory. There's a number of problems with this. First off, that's the argument from silence. Purgatory isn't mentioned here, therefore it isn't true. That's a logical fallacy when used conclusively, so it's a logical fallacy to say this. To say purgatory can't be real because it isn't mentioned in this particular verse. It doesn't make any sense. And it's not even the case that the wording of the verse in question supports this either. Just as it is appointed that human beings die once, and after this the judgment. I can say, I want to go to school, and after I'm done with school, I want to go get a job in the city. And that doesn't rule out any interim period in between. It doesn't rule that out at all. We don't have that from a contextual sense, from a grammatical sense. There's no basis for there being no interim period, no interim state. So this doesn't work as a proof text against purgatory at all. And particularly when we finish reading the thought that's being expressed by the biblical author here. Just as it is appointed that human beings die once, and after this the judgment, so also Christ, offered once to take away the sins of many, will appear a second time, not to take away sin, but to bring salvation to those who eagerly await him. So what we essentially have here in the next verse is we do have a gap of time. So also Christ, offered once to take away the sins of many, will appear a second time, not to take away sin, but to bring salvation to those who eagerly await him. There's a gap of time here. Christ was offered once to take away the sins of many, and the parallel being with human beings dying once. The parallels with that. So we have Christ and his death and his initial offering of himself in the heavenly sanctuary. For more on that, simply go to Hebrews 9:11 through 12. So you have that starting off 33 AD about that, and then we're talking will appear a second time. That is the next reference point, which would be analogous to "and after this the judgment" in verse 27. So let's say we took from today, which is 2008, we simply subtract 33, 1975, 1,975 years. So what we have is Christ offered once, 1,975 years, until he can possibly come for the second time, and he hasn't come yet. So it's 1975 plus. So we have a huge gap, and we have an analogy being drawn here. Just as it is appointed the human beings die once, and after this the judgment. So human beings die, the judgment comes after that. Likewise, analogously, in terms of verse 28, we have, so also Christ offered once, that's the first reference point, to take away the sins of many, will appear a second time. So we have a gap of time in verse 27, just as we have a gap of time in verse 28, because an analogy is being drawn. So there's absolutely no basis for saying that this verse, Hebrews 9:27, rules out purgatory. In fact, if we take verse 28 into consideration, then we don't have an argument against purgatory. We actually have an argument in favor of purgatory. Or at the very least, we have a state of non-hostility towards purgatory. We could say this verse doesn't touch upon it at all. The point is, it doesn't condemn purgatory, it doesn't reject purgatory. It's another instance of an invalid proof text used against Catholic belief. And I guess it just goes to show you that maybe we aren't always totally wrong when it comes to the pages of Scripture.